So I want to finish up, before we get to this is a definition of what we're going to talk about most of the time today, but I want to finish up where we left off last week on the idea of fellowship, because we had just gotten to the points of the practical applications of fellowship when our time ran out. And so I didn't want to squeeze a few things in the last couple minutes and then race you down the hallway to church. So I want to just finish off some thoughts from there. Remember, fellowship is the community of Christ followers gathered for primarily the purpose of spiritual formation and for corporately expressing the presence of Christ in the world, the continuing presence and today, as we'll discover, ministry of Christ in the world. And so there are things that we can only discover about God and express about Christ in the context of fellowship, that we are limited when it's just ourselves. And we came to this point where we understood that there's a whole lot more of God in terms of the substance and content and presence of God in a group of Christ followers than there are in just scattered individuals located throughout communities. So
last week you said donuts and coffee were very crucial.
Well, that's one way the original Greek is translated for fellowship. Yeah. But I think that this fits in with our topic today, because in many ways fellowship is often seen and understood in the New Testament as serving together. That's one of the ways that the church enjoys fellowship is serving together. And so that's why these kind of dovetail together. But we wanted to finish off where we left off last week on the practical applications of fellowship. So we got all the ideas of it kind of in our thinking. But what's the practical piece of that? And one of the things that I wanted to just reiterate is that we can do more for the kingdom together than we can individually. Now, that's not to say that there aren't, important opportunities and valuable things that we can do as individuals, but I think in terms of the overall impact of the community of Christ followers in the world, we can do more in the kingdom together than we can individually. Corey Schlosser Hall, our former executive presbyter, used to quote this. I think it was an African proverb that he quoted and made his own. And he used to say more than once, if you want to go fast, do it yourself. But if you want to go long, do it together. And I think that that's appropriate. Because there is some staying power in what we can accomplish together. So individual efforts, like I said, are important and valuable, but they can be limited in scope and effectiveness. Now, that doesn't mean that the immediate recipient of our individual efforts isn't benefited by that. That's for sure. It's an old story about the guy walking along the beach and all the starfish pulled up or whatever, and he just throws them away, and his friend throws them back, and his friend says, "That's not going to help." And he says, "Well, it helps that one." So I mean, we can make it an individual effort and contribution and benefit in that. But we can together, when you consider the resources available in the body of Christ in terms of capital, in terms of talent and experience, and the longevity of group efforts. I'm always amazed at the kind of talent that is available in the body of Christ. We don't tap that very much, because we don't talk about that a whole lot. A lot of times when we come together, we're not really, we don't know each other well enough to know the kind of creativity and talent that lies within each of us. And I'm sometimes surprised. When we were going to a little church in, well, it's not much, it's a medium size now, but when we were going to a church in Anaheim, it cracks me up when I think about, we sat behind this couple, and they were truly in the, they were in the upper echelons of the senior category, okay? So, and they weren't hiding it or anything, but he was clearly, had lived a long life. But we never really knew much about them except that they were the couple that always sat in front of us in church and so forth. And it wasn't until a few weeks after we had noticed that, and I was friends with the pastor and mentioned that to him, and he said, you don't know who that is, do you? And I said, no, I have no idea. And he says, well, you probably wouldn't know his name, but he's the guy who designed the spacesuit that Neil Armstrong wore when he walked on the moon. That guy personally fit in Neil Armstrong for that suit, and he personally designed it and put it together. And I thought, that's very interesting, amazing, But there's those kinds of stories everywhere, of people who have been engaged in these amazing, marvelous, wonderful, talented ways that we fail sometimes to tap as a congregation, as the community of Christ followers. Why is it that we preserve all of our energy for the things we do at work, but when we come to church, we just kind of leave all that at work, or we leave that at home. We don't tend to collaborate as well in those things as perhaps we should. So that's not a particular hobby horse of mine, but it is an observation that we shouldn't be afraid to tap each other's talents in the cause of Christ and the things of God. So I wanted to just in service of that, to highlight this passage of Scripture that we've referenced before that you know well, the Matthew 25 passage about the sheep and the goats, right? So the sheep and the goats being separated, and I was hungry and you fed me, and so forth. We often translate that and interpret that as individual efforts, right? When did I see you this way? And I mean, there's merit to that approach and precedence for it. I mean, that's how it's usually presented, this particular passage, because we interpret this as an individualized, personalized experience of in the parable. And of course, it is a parable, so we can't spiritualize it, and pull out every little element and say, well, this is. On the other hand, I think if we look at this through a corporate lens, we might see that these ideas that are brought out are representative of systemic issues that the community of Christ followers together can address more effectively than just thinking of ways that an individual might participate in an action once in their lifetime or just occasionally. Like, for instance, the issues are hunger, thirst, nakedness, sick, stranger, imprisoned, right? Those are the things that Jesus talks about in that parable. So if we think about hunger as, obviously food insecurity or disaster relief, I mean, those are things that the church corporately can begin, and in many ways does. The Presbyterian Disaster Assistance Agency and so forth, they come alongside in times of great need. But in terms of food insecurity, there are things that we could be doing. And we participate in those things. I'm just saying this is part of it. This isn't, it's if you didn't give a sandwich to the guy on the corner, doesn't mean you failed in this particular effort. We can participate in broad ways and systemic ways to address these. When you think about the thirst that Jesus talks about, these could be ministries of refreshment. I mean, when you're really thirsty, you want to be refreshed, right? And so these could be ministries of, by the way, this is, and this is probably going to keep us from getting to our subject. But in Revelation, when Jesus talks about to the church of Laodicea, where he says, you're neither hot nor cold. So what does he say? You're lukewarm, so I'm done with you, right? I'm not going to, I'll spew you out of my mouth, I think, and so forth. And so a lot of people are kind of like, well, why is that? Does he want you to be hot or cold? Jesus is just saying, you don't, when I need a hot beverage, you are not that. When I need something cold, you're not that. You're just, you're neutral. You're nothing. And so you don't warm, and you don't refresh. You're just useless in that regard. That's all he means. He doesn't want you to be either on fire or just totally cold so he can wrap you up. It just means you weren't what we needed in this time. You were just there, just flaccid in a sense, not doing anything productive. And that was the problem, not the other aspects. Because he's talking about this issue of refreshment. So ministries of refreshment could be, what could be a ministry of refreshment?
Well, I was thinking of Denise Easter and those weekends that they would put on for prayer.
Okay, that could be a ministry of refreshment.
Renewal ministries.
Could be, yeah, could be.
And supporting that and participating.
Could be. I'm thinking a little bit more practically.
Fellowship.
What?
Food, potlucks.
What could be? Yeah, could be a ministry. That could
Well,
also work.
We used to have here on the Wednesday night meals.
Mm-hmm.
And we just donated, but anybody could come.
Okay.
Why Cook Wednesday?
Yeah, why
Yeah,
could
yeah.
Wednesday?
Yeah.
Which was a blessed fellowship thing. Yeah.
Coffee bar. Yeah.
I was thinking about retreat centers,
Uh huh.
potlucks and, like, we used to have a supper for 6 or 8 people, and we would meet at somebody's house.
Mhm.
They would host it, it was often that you got to know these people.
Yep.
Real well,
Okay.
and, yeah.
And I'm forgetting what it's called, but 10 years ago, we had 2 ladies in our church, Terry Luton and Terry David Brandon, who came alongside a private people that were not necessarily church associated to provide meals 3 times a week in the park. That was largely indigenous people that were in poor condition but could come and have a lunch that is done on 4th Street at I think it's the Unitarian Church.
It's not being done anymore, but.
Yeah.
But it was,
Yeah.
yeah.
But
Marysville
people,
Community Lunch.
yeah, but people in our church, those 2 ladies were the leaders on 2 of the days, and then other church members came alongside some. So that was an intentional way to try to minister, to give food and some comfort to people that were frequently not.
Yep. So, so something else that you might want to bear in mind or think about when you think about ministry of refreshment, people who are providing long-term care for a loved one. When do they get out? When do they get a break?
I had some ladies ministering to me when my husband was very ill and with cancer and before he passed away, but I needed to be with him. But these ladies brought over tea, and it was a very fancy tea. They brought silver teapots and their china and everything. And 2 of their husbands went in to be with my husband in the bedroom, where he was in bed, and they ministered to him.
Yeah.
And that just, after my husband passed away, I had a teacup ministry for a while.
Yeah.
With another widow. And we would go and we would visit widows. And we would take either soup, we had, a cup of soup, or we would have tea and cookies or whatever and visit with them.
So that's an example, and I think alongside of that, I don't know if you've ever worked with hospice before.
Yes.
That's in a sense a ministry of, or that could be a ministry of refreshment if one worked in tandem with that group to provide. I mean, what often gets left undone during those times? Well, you know, a house still needs to be managed, still needs to be cleaned, still needs to be refreshed, that kind of thing. So there are some things one could do for a family in that situation when someone is in that stage of life. Sometimes people need emergency child care. That's an issue of refreshing, giving a break or relief to people in that situation. There are just the idea of providing relief for folks is a way to provide a ministry of refreshment. And there are probably lots more applications if we would just kind of think through them. What about the issue of nakedness? You know, when Jesus said, "I was naked and you clothed me." When I think of that, I think in terms of, obviously, poverty is one of the first issues that kind of comes to mind. The impoverished are always in need. But I also want to think about the fact that nakedness is often a symbol in the Bible for shame. And so ministries against shaming, you know, are a way to do that, providing places of restoration and so forth when people have been engaged in that, or the victims of that. Sometimes employment is an issue. You know, people are underemployed and non-employed, they've been laid off, those kinds of things. Those can be ministries that the church might be able to participate in. Obviously, I was sick and you visited me. That's pretty easy. Ministries of benevolence and care in the middle of illness and so forth. I was a stranger and you invited me in. That could be, in a larger scale, could be immigration issues in your community, you know. It could be welcoming the marginalized in your community, who's on the fringes and who needs a place of safety and welcome. Imprisoned. I was in prison and you visited me. That could translate into justice issues. That could translate into return to society issues. There's actual ministry that I can't remember if it's through the Presbyterian Church or not, but it is something that I know the Bellingham Church is doing. But it's a program that connects congregations with a person in serving time who is within a year or two of their release. And so the congregation builds a relationship with that individual and kind of takes responsibility for that person, that person's well-being. Once they are released, they, because of the relationship they have built in, they bring that person back then into a community of care where they do help that person get reestablished and get employed and have their routines kind of regulated and so forth, and help them adjust to life again without being in prison.
Was that Terra Nueva that was doing that?
Terra Nueva does something like that, yeah. So I mean, it could be something like that, because that will address issues of recidivism, you know, where people return to crime, and sometimes, and I don't know what the stats are on this. I just remember reading an article a long time ago that talked about the fact that sometimes these people who are incarcerated for long periods of time forget how to function apart from that routine. And so they're almost happy to go back into that situation because they don't know how to function very well in free society anymore, but they do know that world. And so that's become familiar to them, and so that may not be the happiest place on earth, but at least they know what to expect there. And so recidivism sometimes becomes just a return to, thank God I'm going back to there. That's kind of a sad state to be in, don't you think? I prefer to be in prison where I know what to expect. So all I'm saying is that these issues in Matthew 25, for instance, and in other places in the New Testament can be unpacked to wider community issues that as a group we may be able to address. You might think of these things individually, go, what can I do, in the face of those kinds of things? Well, we might not be able to do much as individuals, but we might be able to do far more as a community. And we do that. I'm just encouraging that. Another way that fellowship is enhanced is through small group ministries, caring groups where people can be known, where persons can be known personally. And in small groups, you kind of learn by knowing people. You get to know them in a more intimate way than you can in a large church fellowship. You experience God with skin on. There's that old story about the kid who's frightened of the thunderstorm. The mom comes in and says, God will take care of us, in this storm. And he goes, I kind of need a God with skin on at this moment. I don't need a God out there that I don't know. And so we can become that God with skin on for people in times of peril, in times of confusion, in times of distress. So small groups give an opportunity for that kind of care to be given. In a small group, you can have dialogue about issues that are common to all. Sometimes in a large church, particularly small groups are built around people who have either similar interests because of demographic, where they live, or a stage of life that they're in, or something. A small group can address issues that might be common to all in the group, and they might be able to then consider actions by the group that could address the issues that they are experiencing or that they see happening around them. So there can be some common commitment to writing these things that they see. But in a small group, the whole point of any of those things is intentional formation towards acquiring the inner life of Jesus. That's all of it. It's not about getting to know each other better. That's a byproduct of what happens as we get together to be intentionally formed so that our inner life matches the inner life of Jesus, so that we begin to see the world as Jesus sees the world. More importantly, we begin to see God as Jesus saw God. And when we see God like Jesus saw God, then our lives will begin to match what Jesus' life was, because it is that vision that forms our response, not the other way around. Sometimes people think, well, as soon as I clean up my act, then I'll be able to see God. And the fact is, you'll never be able to clean up your act enough, to get to that place. It's actually the reverse. Once you see God, your life cleans up, because just everything else just falls away. It's kind of like that song, turn your eyes upon Jesus. Then the things of earth grow what? Strangely dim. They begin to fade in the light of His glory and grace. Yeah. So that's the key: getting to know God like Jesus knew God. All right, that's fellowship, and I hope that we can think and participate more purposely in those kinds of things, and see them as more than just opportunities to eat together, as important as those are. And it is lovely to be able to get to know people over a meal. That's a good place to do that, and the Bible does that. I mean, there's lots of times where fellowship was a meal setting, and in that time period, that was an important part of their life and a key development. But it's not the only thing. So today we want to talk a little bit about service, and so here's the definition that we want to unpack in our time in service. We engage our goods and strength in the active promotion of the good of others and the causes of God in our world. And so there are some important aspects of this that we want to highlight in our time together. it's important to think about this, that we engage, that we are personally engaged in this process, what belongs to us, our goods and strength, and we do it in the active promotion of the good of others. What is that? What's another word for that? Do you remember? The active promotion of the goods of others. You'll recognize this as soon as I write it. That's the biblical definition of love, right? Seeking the welfare of others. So in service, we engage our goods and strength in loving others. But see, we never talk about what loving others means. We talk about loving others, and we, being Western, cosmopolitan, contemporary people, always attach an emotional sense to that idea of loving, you know. And so we kind of miss the boat because we look at some people that we're called to love and go, I don't even like that person, you know. How do I love that individual? I can't even like him or her. And the point is that loving actually doesn't have that kind of component to it. You can get one in there because honestly, you can't really long hold disregard for somebody for whom this is, you know, going on in your life. If you're actively promoting the good of another person, you're going to end up liking that individual or having favorable feelings for that individual, but that's not necessarily the place you have to begin. And so the active promotion of the good of others is, you know, I may not like the situation, or I don't like the situation you're in. That may be why I'm prompted to do something, because I think the situation you're in is not very good for you. And so I want to help. I want to help you do that. So that's a part of the expression of love. And what did Jesus say? The greatest commandments, what? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. This is the way we do that. Service, active promotion of the good of others, and the causes of God in our world. And this gets a little bit back to the fellowship idea. We want to find ways that we as a community can...
Frank,
Pardon me?
should we pitch that color, or do you?
I don't care.
Oh, okay.
This is where we get back to this idea of fellowship, of tapping the talent in the community. I mean, just think about all the collective resources, both in capital and in ability, that is contained within the body of Christ followers. This has always been. I wanted to at one time do a doctoral dissertation on this idea of why given the pervasiveness of the profession of faith in the United States, of people who believe in God and follow Jesus, because of the pervasiveness of that profession, why are we still in the shape that we're in as a country? If that's really true. And because I wanted to discover either the small percentage of people who actually do profess, and then maybe discover what they were actually doing in terms of changing the community, or to recognize that what we kind of accept as profession of faith is a cultural understanding of that, but not a biblical understanding of that. You know, and that the profession of faith is really just an intellectual assent to a set of ideals. Whereas the biblical idea of faith is confidence in the God who will undergird the things that God makes possible in our life through Jesus Christ. You know, but I abandoned that because it was too philosophical, and I'm a theologian, not a philosopher. So, at any rate, that I think is the idea of service. Is there's those elements that are important to it. It's something we personally do. Now, as we think about this as a spiritual discipline, we have to recognize that we can do this without it being a spiritual discipline. And we often have done that. You know, we have done exactly these kinds of things without it being a spiritual discipline, and that's all fine. And I don't want to discourage that. It doesn't have to be that discipline, because we're not, you know, doing it as a discipline means we're doing this as a means for what? Drawing nearer to Jesus and acquiring more of the inner life of Jesus in that process. You can do that without thinking about that aspect of it. It's okay. And to just do what has to be done in the moment. It could be an act of kindness, you know, in that moment. But if you do it as a spiritual discipline, then you're doing it as a means of drawing closer to Christ. And so if we pray for these kinds of opportunities and we're attentive to what Christ brings to our awareness as the result of that, then we train ourselves away from arrogance, from possessiveness, right? Because we're engaging our goods and resources, against envy, against resentment or covetousness. These things begin to fall away from us, because when we're really engaged in this, then we come from a position of humility into a situation. Not, I have what you need, but what can I do to assist you in this moment? And that becomes an important thing that we'll talk about in just a second. Because it is important when we come to serve that we invite those that are being served to participate in the solution to their issues, rather than to come alongside and say, okay, I have the answer to your problem. You just have to jump through this hoop, you know. And because that doesn't ever work. People will end up jumping through the hoop just to get the help that you're offering in that moment. But that may not be exactly what they need to do. So, when service is a spiritual discipline, it is personal in the sense that we engage in the act of service. It's not like we're telling other people to do this or to be this. It's we're doing this ourselves. So we act in this service using what's within our purview and ability. And so we can't have you can't personally be formed in the image of Jesus if you're not personally engaging your own self in that process. Yes, ma'am.
Forgive me if this is way off base, but
Yep.
I've been thinking about compassion fatigue
Uh-huh.
the last couple of years, and it seems like there are lots of professions and life situations where you might be engaged in service to others. And you said you can do it without it being a spiritual discipline.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, there are lots of people who try to live a life doing good for others because they sense that it's a good thing to do. But it seems like if you're doing it without God being your driving force, compassion fatigue might, this is just speculation, maybe compassion fatigue is more of a danger or a reality or something that might happen.
Yeah.
Because if you're doing it with God driving you, you have a source of strength and you have a source of renewal.
Yeah.
And you might need that demonstrated to you in skin. Sometimes, like
Yeah.
you said, you need those refreshment fellowship opportunities, but then you can turn that towards your spiritual discipline of service.
I think that's a really good point, because even people in spiritual ministries can get compassion fatigue when they forget the point, and the purpose for it. Because if they're not connected to God in the process and receiving that constant infilling of the Spirit, then it can very easily just drain an individual of their own, reserves of compassion or ability to do those things, and then they just burn out.
And the other thought I have with that is that our society is so outcomes driven that even when you are engaged in something that is a service industry or even not as your job, but you decide it's a good thing to be involved at the food bank. We're so focused on outcomes, and if you're trusting that God is in charge of the outcome, and you may not ever see the outcome,
Yeah.
then I think it becomes easier to be involved because that responsibility is lifted from you. Your responsibility is to be here in the moment.
Exactly.
But that's a really hard thing to separate from our society. So
Yeah.
Society doesn't really allow us to do that.
Yeah.
And in light of what she was talking about, having a faith-basing part of that, that allows you to see what God is doing. Whereas if you don't have that basis, it's all about what you're doing.
Exactly,
Not
yeah.
about God is doing.
Yeah. You want to get to the point where, thank you for sharing and leaving. She goes, okay, my work here is done.
They're going to other circles. Wow.
They're going to serve now. Thank you. So yeah, that's a good point. When you want to get to the point, you want to be able to come to the point in your own life where you're able to step back and go, only God could have done this. Only God. When you don't have that faith component, then you do, draw attention to self, and then that becomes the kind of thing that Jesus addressed in the Sermon on the Mount, didn't he? He says, when you do your good deeds, and when you give alms, do it in what? Secret. Yeah, do it in secret, so that your Father knows.
But also let your light shine.
Yes.
Could I throw one comment in?
Yes, sure you
I
can.
think there's a danger of judging people when they burn out.
Mm-hmm.
And judging that they must not be close to God, or they must not be. I mean, I have seen a lot of people in the healthcare world burn out in the last
Yeah.
few years. Many of them wonderful Christians, especially I'm thinking of the nurses in our hospital.
Yeah.
And it's hard to see, but at the same time, they need to take care of themselves.
Yes, it's a good balance, yeah.
And I have had other people kind of judging them and saying, well, if they prayed more, if they prayed more, they wouldn't have burned out. Yes.
Yeah, that's hard too. Thank you for bringing that up. I think that that's an important, kind of balance to what we're talking about. And maybe a place for that ministry of refreshment we talked about earlier. That could be a place of applying that to say, let's help you do this together, because sometimes people are faced with a responsibility for a burden that is beyond their scope, but they begin to chip away at it because if they don't, nothing happens, and so they begin on that process, but it can't be sustained without more resources in there, and so it is important to bring that check into the system. I knew we wouldn't get through all this, but it's only because you guys participate. And obviously the important thing here is not that I get through what's on the page. The important thing is that we have the conversation that makes a difference in the way we're living our lives right now. And so I'm fine with that, and I hope you are too. So maybe what I want to get to here speaks to this issue you just brought up, Jim, that when we serve, we have to remember our limitations in doing that, and recognize that we have a limited amount of resources, and sometimes that self-emptying is an act of love, just like Jesus did as well. But we want to have places where we can be renewed and brought back in and supported in the efforts we're doing. On the other hand, when we're serving, we have to recognize that we have to hold some of what we have so that those who count on us don't pay the price for our service. So we can't give away the farm, so to speak. because there's other people than just us that live on it. And so we have to be aware of the obligations we have to those who depend on us. It's not acting in love if we give away the farm without regard for what these people need from us. Teresa and I know of a woman who grew up in a family where her father was kind of this itinerant evangelist person, and they lived kind of hand to mouth, but he would often give away what was even in their hand, and just totally give away everything that they were counting on to live on as an expression of love for this stranger or person or individual in a greater point of need. And so this person that we know grew up in that sense without the security of knowing where is my next meal coming from, where are we going to live next week, and where am I going to school next year, that kind of thing. There was a great deal of uncertainty that brought up in this person's life, who as a result now, as an adult, this person is as tight-fisted as can be with a very generous kind of income, but feels as though they're on the brink of disaster every moment. Just because in their family of origin they didn't have the security of knowing that a larger purpose was sustaining them, and they were just always, and for her it was like, and God was the one that was directing this process. It took her a long time to get past that idea, but she still harbors some of that uncertainty about God. So this is a consequence of a person not acting in love towards the family for which they were responsible. So part of the discipline of serving other people and delighting in that is to recognize that when we say yes to something, we also have to say no to other things. And so we can't just always say yes. We recognize that we have to reserve our resources. Now sometimes we're in a situation where we can't do as good a job in that based upon what we're tasked with, but we have to recognize a certain limitation to who we are, and say no to other things. And let me just say that we also have to discern the difference between service at a point of need and fostering a codependent situation. There is a difference, and doing the good for somebody else often does not mean continuing to sustain an unsustainable situation. And as a pastor, I've often had that issue, to deal with when people ask for assistance, and it's like, well, I'm happy to help you at a point of need, but we're not a bank in that sense,
Some of the tough love philosophy of doing something to get someone to move on in life, as opposed to, having their technique of getting whatever they want.
It is
It's usually not conscious by the person that's getting what they want.
well, sometimes, and in one instance that I'm thinking of in particular, the person asking for assistance was not the person responsible for the situation that family was in. There was another member of the family who was the primary abuser of the freedom and resources that family had. And this person was just seeking assistance for the welfare of the family as a whole, because they had no control over this individual's use of what was in the family. And so it was a really, really difficult place to be in, because when this person would come seeking assistance, we would say, we have been here time and time again. What's going to change this situation for you? Because, sustaining you in this unsustainable place is not really helping you. But this person felt trapped and unable to leave that situation, and felt like if this person abandoned that situation, then the people for whom she cared would also be abandoned and suffer, from that. So it was a really tough place to be. And we were saying, you need to remove this situation, this person from your situation. And that was something they couldn't do, you know. And so it was really hard to know how to respond to this person, because I felt like every time we offered help, you know, we were sustaining an unsustainable situation. So sometimes you do this for the betterment of the whole, recognizing that this person still needs the assistance, and they're not in a position to make the difference that would change that situation, and that's a tough place to be in. But and sometimes you have to recognize you're going to be swindled in the process. You know, I've had that happen too. You know, where we responded with buckets of assistance only to find out that we were being swindled. And it's like, well, okay, the responsibility is with the swindler on that. You know, we have to be faithful to what we are obligated to do, what God moves us to do in the moment. And sometimes, you know, the training is still good for us. Even if the outcome isn't what we hope for, the training is still good for us. And it's where we have to let go of the outcomes in this process, because we don't know what God is doing. We know God is doing this for our good as we do this. How that manifests in the life of the person we're serving is really between them and God, not between us and them and God. So we have to let go of that. All right, I don't want to keep you from church. There are a few other things, but we can always pick those up again.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you for your time.